customers of New Orleans Public Service won't be paying higher utility bills.
NOPSI customers may soon get a break.
We as customers could expect refund checks.
NOPSI's management sat on its hands for 10 years. They watched Grand Gulf's costs come up, and they simply put all their chips on forcing Grand Gulf's costs down the throats of New Orleans ratepayers.
In 1974, Middle South Utilities began construction on a nuclear power facility in Port Gibson, Mississippi, to be called Grand Gulf. The cost of construction would be borne by its 4 subsidiaries: Arkansas Power and Light, Mississippi Power and Light, Louisiana Power and Light, and New Orleans Public Service Incorporated. 5 years later, the first signs of resistance to Grand Gulf would emerge when the Arkansas utility backed out of its agreement to purchase Grand Gulf Power. This move shifted an even greater percentage of the remaining burden to the other subsidiaries. At the time, Gary Groesch, head of Citizens for Safe Energy, a group protesting Waterford 3 nuclear power plant on safety grounds, reads of Arkansas's pullout of Grand Gulf.
And from a question of simply nuclear power as a safety issue, we began to see how nuclear power was being fit into the local utility company, how the local regulatory agencies, meaning the City Council of New Orleans and also the Public Service Commission, were dealing with these new power plants. And we could see, therefore, that there was no question here more than just safety. There was a question of economics.
In 1980, during a routine rate increase hearing, the City Council learns of NOPSI's obligation to purchase 29% of Grand Gulf's power output. In response to questioning by Councilman Brod Baggart, NOPSI's Jim Kane assures the Council that Grand Gulf Power will be a boon to New Orleans ratepayers, saving them $1.7 million per year in reduced utility bills. Besides, he says, if the city doesn't wish to pay for Grand Gulf, it doesn't have to. Both assertions are patently false. 1 year later, the city incredibly gives up regulatory control via a Thanksgiving weekend referendum wholly paid for by NOPSI.
It was a single-issue referendum, and NOPSI was able to win this referendum vote, which transferred regulatory power away from the City of New Orleans to the Public Service Commission in Baton Rouge. The reason that this took place was because the utility companies understood that they had a number of nuclear power plants that they wanted to bring online, and they thought it would be easier to deal with one centralized regulatory agencies than a couple of disparate agencies around the state.
Also during this period, Citizens for Safe Energy and others proposed a municipal buyout. After researching public power in general, and specifically NOPSI's franchise with the city, they are convinced that municipalization is the city's best hope of avoiding the disastrous boondoggle of Grand Gulf. In January of 1983, with mounting community pressure and embarrassed by its blunder in relinquishing regulatory power over NOPSI, the city appoints the Task Force on Municipalization and Alternatives. It is headed by UNO professor Bobby DuPont. 2 years later, after a lengthy investigation, the task force returns its verdict on municipalization with a resounding yes in favor of an immediate buyout.
There are generic reasons that it is good to have a publicly owned utility. You have local control, you tend to have lower rates, you don't have to pay stockholders, you have certain tax advantages. There are reasons that it's good just on its face to have a publicly owned utility. But in this circumstance, we thought, hey, we may be able to buy out this utility and avoid Grand Gulf's costs.
On January 21st, 4 days after the task force renders its findings, the city finds itself under a rolling blackout.
Nobody really knew what was going on. So when the television's electricity came back on, we were able to watch television, and the utility companies came on the air and said, look, the lights went out, there was a freeze. If the people who are opposing the nuclear plants would get out of the way of the licensing of those plants, hey, we wouldn't have these kind of blackouts.
In May of '85, after rallying an increasing level of support over the years, Gary and other community activists who would later form the Alliance would achieve a major victory for their relentless work over the preceding 5 years.
It was clear to the great majority of the citizens. We got 63% of the vote. the utility companies spent millions of dollars in opposition to this proposition in 1985. We still beat them, and it was because we were right. We needed our own local control, and that was the engine that really shot the Alliance for Affordable Energy into orbit.
The remainder of 1985 was spent rallying community forces against a NOPSI proposed rate hike of 60%. The buyout was still an ongoing goal, but if it were to be achieved, it would take the gathering of disparate community forces under one banner. The Alliance for Affordable Energy was born.
There was a core of people that were highly committed to this, and I was one of them. Tom Lowenberg, Karen Wimpelberg, Betty Wisdom, Stuart Phillips, many people like this, and we made a decision jointly that, hey, we've got to do this right. We've got to get funding, we've got to have an office, we've got to do this full-time, because all of us were doing it part-time largely. And in order to do a watchdog function effectively, you've got to be full-time. And that's what we've been able to do.
Either the old year ended with a bang or the new year was rung in with great promise as Gary receives Gambit's New Orleanian of the Year award for his work in helping the city regain regulatory control of NOPSI. With a new office to work out of and a sense of growing support, the Alliance continues to pursue the larger goal of a utility buyout while continuing to define itself as a champion of good government. During Jazz Fest, the Alliance hands out thousands of checks made out to NOPSI for $165 million with stop payments stamped on them. Hundreds of angry ratepayers mail them into their council members. Simple device, the checks nonetheless focus public awareness in a graphic way. The heavy response lets city council members know that New Orleans wants no part of Grand Gulf nuclear power. Feeling the heat from the Alliance's relentless efforts to rally the community against Grand Gulf, NOPSI embarks on an expensive ad campaign designed to dampen growing community support for a buyout. They hope in the process to reverse the decline in their badly sagging public image.
What we have now is a privately owned company pretty much with the professional expertise, and I continue to allude to that because that is so very important here.
Well, first of all, honesty. Tell the people how it really is.
And I think that you would get the greatest amount of economy in a public company, such as NOPSI, that is privately controlled, if that company will hold itself up for public scrutiny.
The Alliance responds with a simply worded public service announcement. At the same time, they file a fairness doctrine suit against WWL for failing to air the spot in balance to the NOPSI campaign.
Did you know that your electric bill is going to double? Why? Because NOPSI wants you to pay for a $4 billion mistake, Grand Gulf Nuclear Power Plant. NOPSI never even asked the City Council for permission to buy Grand Gulf. Fortunately, there is a way out. The city has the right to buy NOPSI without paying for Grand Gulf. But we must act now.
On May 17, 1990, the final showdown on a buyout of Grand Gulf occurs in a 5-2 City Council vote against it. Dissenting votes are cast by council members Taylor and Jackson.
And I think people began to think, well, gee, if they're not doing this correctly, and even the Alliance is criticizing the way that the City Council is going forward, might not they screw up running a utility company? And it was a difficult question to answer. Yes, they may have picked the wrong management firm, for instance, or they may have made decisions that would hurt the service of the city. I think that there was ways to work around it, but nonetheless, it was always a double-edged sword.
But the Alliance has lost the battle, not the war. All along, it has pursued a two-pronged strategy in its opposition to Grand Gulf. On the one hand, a buyout solution. On the other, the remedy of lawsuits filed to establish NOPSI's imprudence in locking New Orleans into Grand Gulf's power. At long last, they are vindicated by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals.
NOPSI customers may soon get a break. A court decision today stops NOPSI from passing along some of its Grand Gulf costs to ratepayers. The news came as a surprise to those at today's City Council meeting.
Oddly enough, the council was supposed to consider a rate hike for NOPSI today. That was postponed with news of the Court of Appeals decision, which says NOPSI made about $500 million worth of unwise decisions about the Grand Gulf nuclear plant. It also says shareholders, not ratepayers, should foot the bill.
And the city council was absolutely dumbfounded. They were totally knocked off their pedestal, and they went into executive session. And they came back out and they congratulated us for winning this lawsuit. And they said, well, you know, we're also not going to pass through this rate hike right now because we need to look at the effect of this judgment on our power. And it was an amazing experience.
A major thrust of the Alliance's efforts over the years has gone towards promoting a least-cost energy strategy for the city. They've hired nationally respected expert Emery Lovins to do a least-cost plan for New Orleans.
Least-cost planning is a strategy that utility companies are using all around the country in order to keep down utility demand for power. There's two things that can be done now. We can either keep power demand down, or we can build new expensive power plants. What's happening in California, what's happening in Massachusetts, is that they're investing in energy efficiency, and they're finding that it's cheaper to invest in efficiency than it is to build new power plants.
Every grassroots organization needs a patron saint, and in Betty Wisdom, the Alliance found one. Her unflagging support for the Alliance has been central to its success. Another consistent supporter over the years, Stuart Phillips. Throughout it all, and in meeting the challenges of the future, the Alliance's most crucial source of energy has been, and will continue to be, people.